In this lecture, we are going to talk about the third example of suffixal homophones, which is the ed. Ed has two suffixal homophones. It has two suffixes with the same pronunciation but different meaning. The first one is ed past participle, which is inflectional, and the second one is ed adjectival, which is derivational. The first suffixal homophone of ed is ed past participle. This ed is inflectional, and it can be found in perfect tenses in addition to passive sentences. For example, I have passed the exam successfully. Passed is a verb that ends with ed, but what kind of ed is this? Is it ed past participle or ed adjectival? In fact, it is ed past participle because we have a present perfect tense, have passed. So ed is ed past participle. The mirror was broken by Tom. This sentence is in the passive voice. Was broken. Was plus a verb in the past participle form. So broken contains ed past participle because it is in the past participle form. And this ed is not a suffix, it is an infix. So ed past participle in broken comes in the form of an infix. However, it is ed past participle, which is an inflectional affix. So in perfect tenses and in passive sentences, we have ed past participle. In addition to passive and perfect sentences, we can find ed past participle before nouns. We know that before a noun is the position of an adjective. So the ed form before a noun is going to be an adjective. However, if the ed form is not an adjective, it means that the ed is ed past participle. How to know that the ed form before a noun is an adjective or not? We have to apply the two tests that we applied with the ing. The first one is to put one of the qualifiers before the ed form, like very, rather, quite, more, and most. And the second one is to put the ed form after the verb seem. Let's have an example. I use a published thesis in my research paper. In this sentence, we have an ed form, published, that comes before a noun, thesis. So thesis is a noun, published is the ed form. Now we have to decide whether the ed in published is ed adjectival or ed past participle. We can apply the two tests, starting with the first one. I use a very published thesis in my research paper. Can I say I use a very published thesis in my research paper? We cannot. We cannot modify published by saying very published. It's wrong, according to meaning. And your thesis seems published, and it also doesn't make sense. That is why, because we cannot use very or put published after seem, and it doesn't make sense. So published is not an adjective, and the ed in published, because it is not an adjective, the ed in published is ed past participle, not ed adjectival. The second suffixal homophone of ed is ed adjectival. Ed adjectival is derivational, not inflectional. And we can find ed adjectival in adjective position. As we've said, adjectives can be found in English before a noun, after the verb be, or after a linking verb. The frightened boy hid himself in the kitchen. Boy is a noun. Before boy, we have an ed form, frightened, a verb that ends with ed. We have to think about this ed. Is it ed past participle or is it ed adjectival? Well, frightened is an adjective. We can say the very frightened boy. So, frightened here in its proper position. It is an adjective that comes before a noun, which makes ed in frightened as ed adjectival, because frightened is an adjective, so ed is ed adjectival. She stood with a surprised look on her face. We have a noun, look, and we have an ed form that comes before the noun, surprised. Now we have to decide whether this ed in surprised is ed past participle or ed adjectival. In fact, it is ed adjectival because surprised is an adjective. I can say she stood with a very surprised look on her face. Because of that, because I can modify surprised with very, surprised is an adjective. And because it is an adjective, the ed in surprised is ed adjectival, not ed past participle. The last example is, my friend was astonished after receiving her father's gift. The ed form is astonished. It comes after the verb be, which is was in this sentence. Was astonished. Astonished in this sentence is an adjective. And the ed is ed adjectival, not ed past participle. To make sure that astonished is an adjective, put very. My friend was very astonished after receiving her father's gift. So, it accepted very as a modifier. That is why astonished is an adjective and the ed in astonished is ed adjectival, not ed past participle. The only ambiguous case with the suffixal homophones of ed is when the ed form comes before a noun. When the ed form comes before a noun, we have to think of two possibilities. Either the ed form is an adjective or it is not an adjective. If it is an adjective, then the ed is ed adjectival. If it is not an adjective, then the ed is ed past participle. How to know whether the ed form is an adjective or not when it comes before a noun? We have to apply the two tests that we used with ing. Let's see this with two examples. In the first test, we can use very, rather, quite, more, and most, any one of them. We can put it before the ed form. If it is acceptable according to meaning, so the ed form is an adjective. If it is not acceptable according to meaning, so the ed form is not an adjective. We have frightened boy and published thesis. Can we say a very frightened boy? A very frightened boy? Yes, we can say a very frightened boy. So frightened is an adjective and the ed in frightened is ed adjectival. But can we say a very published thesis? A very published thesis? It's not acceptable according to meaning. So, published is not an adjective, although it comes before a noun, but it is not an adjective. And the ed is not ed adjectival. Here it is ed past participle. In the second test, we can put the ed form after the linking verb seem. The boy seems frightened. The boy seems frightened. It sounds natural and it seems okay according to meaning. So frightened here is an adjective, and the ed in this adjective is ed adjectival because frightened is an adjective. But can we say the thesis seems published? The thesis seems published. It doesn't make sense because the thesis is either published or it is not published. But seems published, it seems weird and odd to say so. That is why published is not an adjective, because we cannot say the thesis seems published, and we cannot say a very published thesis. So published is not an adjective. And because it is not an adjective, the ed is not ed adjectival. It is ed past participle.